In the late spring of 2023, Elias Thorne, who was 72 years old and had farmed the same 180 acres in the Black Kettle Valley his entire life, took possession of 25 oxen. They arrived on a Tuesday in 3 long cattle trailers, their hooves clattering down the metal ramps onto the hard-packed dirt of his yard. They were animals nobody wanted, the obsolete remnants of a historical farm park that had lost its county funding a month prior. His neighbors, men he had known since birth, watched the unloading from their own properties. They watched from the cabs of their new air-conditioned tractors, machines that had cost them, collectively, over $12 million. They saw the old man and his grandson leading the beasts into the north pasture, and in the quiet, climate-controlled comfort of their modern equipment, they laughed. They believed Elias Thorne had finally, irrevocably, lost his mind. They laughed for 47 days. On the 48th day, the laughter stopped. Let me tell you about the Black Kettle Valley. It is not a valley in the grand, sweeping sense of the word. It is a shallow, 8-mile-long depression in the foothills of the Appalachian Range, carved by a creek that runs slow and brown most of the year. The land was settled in the 1840s by Scots-Irish families who cleared the timber and broke the soil with their own hands and with the help of oxen. Elias Thorne's great-grandfather, a man named Caleb Thorne, was one of them. He had claimed his 180 acres in 1849, built a stone foundation for a house, and then a barn. The foundation was still there, serving as the base for the house Elias lived in. The barn had been rebuilt twice after fires, once in 1911 and again in 1958, but its footprint had never changed. The land was Thorne land, and it held the memory of every season, every drought, every flood, and every Thorne who had worked it. The soil was a dark, rich loam in the creek bottoms, but grew thinner and rockier as it rose toward the valley walls. It was good land, but it was not easy land. It demanded attention. It demanded respect. For 174 years, it had received it. The change began not with a bang, but with a meeting. It was held on a cold February evening in the Grange Hall, a white clapboard building that smelled of stale coffee and generations of damp wool coats. Marcus Vance called the meeting. Vance was 38 years old, had worked for the State Department of Agriculture for 6 years, and held a master's degree in agribusiness from a large Midwestern university. He was known for his crisp shirts, his confident handshake, and his unwavering belief in data. He stood at the front of the room with a projector screen behind him, displaying charts and graphs in bright, optimistic colors. He was the face of the Valley Forward Initiative, a state-funded program designed to increase agricultural output in what the state considered underperforming rural sectors. The centerpiece of his proposal was a 400-acre parcel of common land at the far western end of the valley. It was known to everyone as the Stone Yard. For as long as anyone could remember, it had been used for nothing more than rough pasture for a handful of cattle. The soil was notoriously thin, the incline was steep, and it was littered with field stones. Vance's plan was to use state subsidies to bring it into full production. He had data. He showed them soil analysis reports, topographical surveys, and yield projections for high-density corn planting. The reports, based on core samples taken every 50 yards to a depth of 12 inches, indicated rocky loam. Difficult, he admitted, but not impossible. Not with the right equipment. And that was the heart of his pitch. The Valley Forward Initiative offered a 40% subsidy on the purchase of new agricultural machinery with a horsepower rating of 300 or more. He showed them pictures of gleaming green John Deere 8 R models and massive, red case IH Magnums. He talked about efficiency, about acres per hour, about GPS-guided auto steer that could plow a perfectly straight line in the dead of night. He presented a spreadsheet that calculated the amortization of the loans against the projected increase in yield from the new acreage. The numbers were compelling. A farmer could take out a loan for a $250,000 tractor, receive a $100,000 subsidy from the state, and pay off the remaining $150,000 in 7 years. After that, it was pure profit. It was the future, he said, delivered to their doorstep. The 20 farmers in the room, men whose incomes had been stagnant for a decade, who were watching their children leave the valley for city jobs, saw a lifeline. They saw a way to compete, a way to survive. They listened, and they began to believe. Elias Thorne sat in the back row, next to his grandson, Leo. Leo was 22, strong and capable, but he had the restlessness of his generation. He saw the new tractors on the screen, and his eyes lit up. He saw progress. Elias saw something else. When Vance finished his presentation and asked for questions, Elias raised a hand, gnarled and stained with the soil of his farm. He did not stand. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still room. "You took your samples down to 12 inches, Mr. Vance." "That's correct," Vance said, smiling. "Standard protocol. It gives us a complete profile of the topsoil." Elias nodded slowly. "My great-grandfather used to say, anything a man can learn in a day isn't worth knowing. Anything you can learn about a field from the top foot isn't worth knowing either. What's underneath?" Vance's smile tightened slightly. He clicked a button, and a geological survey map appeared. "Bedrock. Some granite shield deposits, but it's deep, well below the plow line. Our ground-penetrating radar confirms it. The data is clear, Mr. Thorne." Elias looked at the screen, then back at the young man. He said, "The land doesn't care about your data. It only cares about what it is." A few of the other farmers shifted in their seats. They respected Elias, but this sounded like the ramblings of an old man afraid of change. Vance seized the opening. "I understand the attachment to tradition, I truly do. But we can't let nostalgia stand in the way of profitability, of sustainability. A 400-horsepower tractor can plow 15 acres of that land in a day. An ox, what, maybe one? The math isn't emotional. It's just math." He was right, of course. The math was inescapable. By the end of the meeting, 8 of the Valley's most influential farmers had signed letters of intent. Within a month, they had secured loans totaling nearly $2 million. The future was coming to Black Kettle Valley, and it ran on diesel. 2 weeks later, Elias saw the notice. It was printed on cheap paper and pinned to the corkboard at the Agway feed store, tucked between an ad for a used hay baler and a flyer for a church potluck. The Pioneer Heritage Farm, a living history museum 60 miles east, was closing. Its collection of antique farm equipment was being auctioned off. Its livestock was being sold. The notice listed 12 heritage breed pigs, 40 chickens, and a working herd of 25 trained oxen. If no buyer was found by the end of the month, the oxen would be sold for meat. The price for a trained, 8-year-old ox was listed at $1,200. The price for its meat was about $800. The world had declared a 33% loss on its continued existence as a working animal. Elias stood there for a long time, looking at the grainy photograph of a team of American milking Devons, their horns long and curved, their eyes patient. He saw the yoke across their necks. It was a design he recognized. Let me tell you about the yokes. In his barn, hanging on a wall of whitewashed planks, were 3 wooden yokes. They were not decorations. They were tools, and they were history. The oldest was a massive neck yoke carved from a single piece of black cherry in 1888 by his great-grandfather, Caleb. The wood was dark, almost black, and worn smooth as river stone in the places where it had rested on the necks of generations of oxen. It weighed 75 pounds. It was designed for clearing stumps and dragging stones, a tool of brute force. The second was a head yoke, brought over from Germany by his grandfather's brother-in-law in 1922. It strapped to the horns, allowing for more precise control, better for plowing contoured fields. The third was a Withers yoke Elias himself had helped his father build in 1965. It was lighter, made of ash, and rested just in front of the animal's hump. It was a compromise, a balance of power and maneuverability. These are not just pieces of wood. They were repositories of knowledge. They were physical manifestations of a conversation between man, animal, and land that had been going on for more than a century. To use them was to participate in that conversation. A tractor, Elias knew, did not converse. It shouted. He drove home from the feed store and walked into his barn. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool wood of the black cherry yoke. He could feel the faint grain, the subtle indentations left by the chains. He went back into the house, found a phone number for the Pioneer Heritage Farm on the notice, and made a call. He spoke to the director, a tired-sounding woman who was heartbroken at having to dismantle her life's work. He didn't try to bargain. He asked what she wanted for all 25 animals. She paused. "If you take them all," she said, "and promise to give them a working home, you can have them for the cost of transport." The cost was $2,500. It was nearly all the cash Elias had. He agreed without hesitation. Leo was aghast. 25 of them? Granddad, what are we going to do with 25 oxen? We can barely feed the 6 cows we have. We'll find a way, Elias said. But why? The tractors are coming. Everyone says this is the future. Elias looked at his grandson. He saw the appeal, the power, the speed, the ease. It was seductive. It promised a life without the back-breaking labor that had defined his own. He wanted that for Leo, but not at any cost. "The future isn't a destination, Leo," he said. "It's just the place where you find out if your past was worth a damn." The arrival of the oxen was a spectacle. The whole valley seemed to turn out to watch the 3 cattle trailers navigate the narrow dirt road to the Thorn Farm. The animals were a mix of breeds, russet-colored Devons, big-boned brown Swiss crosses, a few shaggy Scottish Highlands. They were huge, some weighing over 2,000 pounds, and they moved with a slow, deliberate gravity. The neighbors watched, arms crossed, and shook their heads. It was a circus, a living museum exhibit. Tom Henderson, who farmed the land adjacent to Elias, had just taken delivery of a John Deere 8 or 370. It sat in his yard, gleaming in the sun, a machine that cost more than the Thorn Farm was worth. He called over the fence to Elias. "Having a parade, Elias?" "Just getting ready for work, Tom," Elias called back. Henderson laughed, a loud, booming sound. "Don't you know? They invented the engine. You don't have to do it the hard way anymore." Elias just smiled and nodded, leading a big, dun-colored ox named Solomon into the pasture. "The hard way is sometimes the only way that lasts," he said, but he said it to himself. For the next 6 weeks, Elias and Leo worked with the oxen. It was a slow, patient process of re-establishing trust and rhythm. The animals had been trained, but they had been used mostly for demonstrations, pulling a wagon of tourists around a paved loop. They hadn't felt the real resistance of a plow in years. Elias chose 12 of the strongest, most placid animals to form 6 working teams. He brought out the old yokes. He spent a day just cleaning them, rubbing them with linseed oil until the wood glowed. He and Leo fitted them to the teams, adjusting the leather straps, checking for any points of rubbing or discomfort. The first yoke he used was the old black cherry one, Caleb Thorne's yoke. He fitted it to Solomon and a powerfully built brown Swiss named Abe. The first week, they did nothing but walk the teams around the pasture, getting them used to the feel of the yokes and the sound of his voice. His commands were quiet, almost conversational. G for right, ha for left, woe to stop. They were words that had echoed in this valley for nearly 200 years. The new tractors, meanwhile, arrived one by one on massive flatbed trucks, their tires taller than a man. Their arrival was announced by the hiss of air brakes and the low rumble of their diesel engines. They were parked in neat rows in their new owners' yards, monuments to the new age of agriculture in Black Kettle Valley. The farmers spent their time reading the 300-page operating manuals and learning the intricacies of the GPS displays. They were learning a new language, a language of software updates and error codes. Elias was teaching Leo an old one. He taught him how to read the animals, how to see the flick of an ear that meant a fly was bothering them, the slight shift in weight that meant they were bracing to pull, the droop of a head that meant they were tired. He showed him how an ox feels the land through its hooves, how it can sense a soft spot or a buried rock before a man ever could. "This is the technology," he told Leo, pointing to Solomon's broad, intelligent face. "The ability to feel and respond. A tractor can only push or brake. An ox can think." Leo was a quick study. He had his grandfather's patience. He was still uncertain, still felt the pull of the gleaming machines on the other side of the fence, but he felt something else too. A connection, a sense of purpose that went deeper than profit and loss. He learned the names of all 25 oxen. He learned which ones prefer to work on the left side of the team and which ones prefer the right. He learned that Solomon was the natural leader, calm and steady, and that Abe was the muscle, always willing to put his shoulder into the work. He was learning the language of the yoke. In mid-April, the work began. The consortium of 8 farmers, with Marcus Vance as their unofficial supervisor, moved their new equipment to the edge of the 400-acre stone yard. It was an impressive sight. 8 massive tractors, each pulling a 14-bottom moldboard plow. The plows themselves were marvels of engineering, intricate arrangements of steel and hydraulics that cost $45,000 each. Vance walked among the machines with a clipboard and a stopwatch, a general preparing his army for battle. A small crowd of other valley residents gathered to watch. This was the moment of vindication. Elias and Leo were there, too. They had brought 2 teams, for oxen in total, hitched to an old Oliver walking plow that had been rusting in the back of the barn. It was a single furrow plow. Next to the enormous, multi-bladed implements of the tractors, it looked like a child's toy. Tom Henderson saw it and chuckled. Brought a knife to a gunfight, Elias. Elias looked at the massive machines, then at his oxen, who stood quietly, chewing their cud. Maybe, he said, or maybe you all brought cannons to a fist fight. The tractors started their engines. The sound was a deafening roar that rolled across the valley and sent birds scattering from the trees. The ground vibrated. One by one, they lowered their plows and began to move forward. The steel blades bit into the earth, and the rocky soil of the stone yard began to turn. It was an awesome display of power. The tractors moved at a steady 5 miles per hour, leaving behind them a wide, dark ribbon of turned earth. In the first hour, they plowed nearly 10 acres. Vance was beaming, making notes on his clipboard. This was efficiency. This was progress. This was the data made real. Elias and Leo waited until the tractors were far down the field. Then Elias took the handles of his walking plow. He spoke a quiet word to Solomon and Abe. They leaned into the black cherry yoke, all 4,200 pounds of them, and the single blade of the old Oliver plow slipped into the soil. They moved at the speed of a slow walk. The only sounds were the creak of the wooden yoke, the soft jingle of the harness chain, and the whisper of the steel blade slicing through the earth. They were not conquering the land. They were negotiating with it. For 2 days, the valley was divided by the sounds of 2 different centuries. On one side, the constant, overwhelming roar of the diesel engines. On the other, the quiet, rhythmic sounds of man and animal working in concert. The tractors plowed 65 acres. Elias and Leo plowed 3. The gap between the old way and the new way was measured in horsepower and acres, and the new way was winning by an astonishing margin. Leo felt a familiar pang of doubt. He watched the tractors turning at the far end of the field, their movements so swift and certain, and he wondered if his grandfather was just being stubborn. He saw the smirks on the faces of the other farmers as they watched them, this living diorama of a bygone era. Vance came over on the afternoon of the second day. He was trying to be polite, but his condescension was palpable. He stood beside Elias, watching the oxen rest at the end of a furrow. You have to admit, Elias, the efficiency is undeniable, he said, gesturing toward the vast expanse of plowed land. Elias wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at the turned earth. It's fast, I'll give you that. Vance pressed his advantage. It's more than fast. It's profitable. It's the future. What you're doing here it's admirable. It's quaint, but it's not a business model. Elias looked at his oxen. Solomon flicked an ear, listening. A business model is just a story you tell about the future, he said. And sometimes the story is wrong. He picked up the handles of his plow. Come on, boys. Let's go. The third day dawned clear and cool. The air was full of the smell of turned earth. The tractor started up again at 7 a.m. sharp. The lead machine, Tom Henderson's new 8R370, lowered its massive plow and began to move. It had gone less than 100 yards when it happened. There was no warning. One moment the tractor was moving forward, a picture of unstoppable power. The next, it stopped dead, as if it had hit a mountain. The engine screamed as the wheels spun uselessly in the loose dirt. Then came a sound. It was not a bang, not a snap. It was a deep, resonant, gut-wrenching groan of tortured metal, a sound that spoke of forces that were not meant to be opposed. Tom Henderson shut down the engine. The sudden silence was shocking. He climbed down from the cab, his face a mask of confusion. The other tractor operators stopped their machines and walked over. Vance hurried across the plowed ground, his clipboard held tight against his chest. What they saw made them all go quiet. The plow was destroyed. The front three bottoms were bent backwards, the thick steel shares twisted into grotesque shapes. The massive main beam, a piece of tempered steel a foot thick, was bowed. The hydraulic shear bolt, a safety mechanism designed to snap and protect the implement from just this kind of impact, had done its job. It had sheared clean in half. But the tractor's forward momentum, all 18 tons of it moving at 5 miles per hour, had been too great. The force had been transferred directly to the plow, and the plow had met something that refused to move. They brought in another tractor, fitted with a heavy-duty subsoiler, to try and find the obstruction. They found it 18 inches below the surface. It wasn't a boulder. Vance's shallow soil samples and ground-penetrating radar had told a convenient but incomplete story. They had detected rock, but had interpreted it as scattered, individual stones. They had failed to see the pattern. It was a wall, a dry-laid stone wall, 3 feet wide and built of massive, flat granite slabs, the kind of stones that take 4 men or 2 oxen to move. It was part of an ancient system, forgotten to time, a network of walls that grid the entire 400-acre field. No one knew who had built them. Perhaps early settlers who had given up on the land. Perhaps Native Americans, thousands of years before. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they were there. They were an integral part of the land itself. The tractors had been programmed with a story about the land, a story written in spreadsheets and soil samples. And that story was a fiction. Their brute force, their greatest asset, had become their fatal flaw. They were too powerful, too rigid. They knew how to push, but not how to feel. When they encountered a problem they couldn't solve with force, their only other option was to break. The cost of a new plow was $45,000. The cost to repair Henderson's might be half that, if it could be repaired at all. They tried to continue to plow around the obstruction, but it was no use. 10 minutes later, a second tractor hit another section of the wall. This time, the impact not only ruined the plow, but also cracked the tractor's rear axle housing, a repair that would cost at least $20,000 and take weeks. The work stopped. The 8 magnificent machines stood silent in the field, useless. The farmers gathered in a grim circle, their faces pale with the sudden, crushing realization of their financial folly. The $12 million they had spent on tractors, the millions in loans they now owed, had purchased them nothing but a field of broken steel and a mountain of debt. Marcus Vance stood apart from them, staring at the exposed stone wall. His clipboard hung limply at his side. His data, his charts, his entire worldview had been shattered against a buried rock. Across the field, the silence was broken by a familiar, quiet sound. The creak of a wooden yoke. Elias and Leo had been working their own small plot, moving slowly and steadily. Now, they approached the edge of the stone yard. The crowd of farmers and onlookers turned to watch them. 50 people, and not a single one of them spoke. Elias guided his team, Solomon and Abe, toward the spot where Henderson's plow had broken. He did not drive them hard. He let them walk at their own pace. 10 feet from the buried wall, Solomon slowed. He took another step, then stopped. He lowered his head slightly and leaned back against the yoke, signaling to Abe, who immediately stopped as well. The Oliver plow, its single blade buried in the earth, came to a gentle halt. Solomon had felt the change in the soil density through his hooves. He had felt the slight, preliminary scrape of the plow tip against the unyielding stone. He had felt a problem he could not solve with force, and so he had stopped. He had not broken. He had not even been stressed. He had simply reported the facts of the situation to his driver. Elias walked forward and placed the toe of his boot on the ground where the plow had stopped. He nodded. He and Leo took up shovels and, in 5 minutes of digging, exposed the top of the same granite wall. Elias left the shovels where they lay. He walked over to Marcus Vance, who was still staring at the ground as if he could will the wall to disappear. The other farmers watched, their faces a mixture of shame and awe. This was the moment for Elias to gloat, to say, "I told you so," to claim his victory. He did none of those things. He looked at the younger man, not with anger or triumph, but with something that looked almost like pity. He spoke quietly, his voice barely carrying to the first row of onlookers. "An animal knows the difference between something it can move and something it can't," he said. "A machine only knows the difference between moving and braking." That was all. He turned and walked back to his team. He backed them up a few feet, steered them to the left, and continued his furrow, plowing parallel to the wall, not through it. He was not fighting the land. He was working with it. The crowd watched him go, the slow, steady progress of the old man, the young man, the 4 oxen, and the single-bladed plow. In the silence left behind, the 8 new tractors looked like tombstones. The aftermath in Black Kettle Valley was quiet and profound. There were no lawsuits, no public recriminations. There was only the heavy, private weight of consequence. The Valley Forward Initiative was officially declared a failure 6 months later. The state quietly absorbed some of the losses, but the 8 farmers were still deeply in debt for machines they could not use as intended. Tom Henderson sold 40 acres of his best bottom land to cover his repair bills and the first of his loan payments. 2 other farmers would eventually go bankrupt over the next 5 years, their land bought up by a corporate farm from out of state that had no interest in the valley's history. The stone yard was left fallow, a 400-acre monument to the high cost of cheap confidence. The broken plows were hauled away for scrap. Elias and Leo finished plowing their 20 acres. They did not try to remove the Great Walls. They used the oxen, now working in practiced, rotating teams, to pull out the smaller, freestanding boulders, dragging them to the edge of the field to create new boundary walls. They worked around the larger, subterranean structures, creating smaller, irregularly shaped fields that followed the land's true contours. It was inefficient by any modern measure. It took them all summer, but by the fall, the land was cleared and planted with a cover crop of winter rye. The next spring, a strange thing happened. Tom Henderson appeared at Elias's gate. He was a proud man, and it took him a long time to speak. He didn't ask to borrow the oxen. He asked if his 19-year-old son could come and work with Leo to learn. Elias agreed. 2 weeks later, another farmer came with a similar request for his daughter. Elias Thorne did not lend out his animals. He shared his knowledge. He and Leo started holding workshops on Saturday mornings. They taught the younger generation of the valley how to fit a yoke, how to hold the lines, how to speak the old language of G and Ha. They taught them the difference between the feel of a root and the feel of a rock, transmitted from the plowshare up through the handles. They were not teaching nostalgia. They were teaching resilience. They were teaching an alternative technology, a technology of patience, observation, and partnership. Leo found his purpose there. The restlessness left him, replaced by a quiet competence. He became the valley's foremost expert on draft animal power. He learned how to shoe an ox, how to treat their ailments, and how to breed them for strength and temperament. The herd of 25 unwanted oxen became the foundation of a new, more sustainable economy in the valley. Their offspring, trained by Leo and the young people he taught, were soon working on half a dozen farms, doing the slow, careful work the tractors could not. They were used in the woodlets for selective logging that didn't damage the surrounding forest. They were used to plow the small, rocky fields that had been abandoned a generation before. They were not a replacement for the tractor, but a complement to it. They were the right tool for the right job. Marcus Vance was reassigned to a desk in the state capitol. His job was to process farm subsidy paperwork. He spent his days in a cubicle under fluorescent lights, reviewing the very kind of data-driven proposals that had led to the disaster in Black Kettle Valley. He became, in the end, a functionary of the system he had once championed, a living testament to its limitations. 10 years after the tractors fell silent, the valley was a different place. It was poorer on paper. The total agricultural output had declined, but it was also more stable. The farmers who had survived had learned to diversify. They had smaller fields, more varied crops, and a deeper understanding of their land. They were less dependent on the price of diesel and the cost of imported steel. They were in conversation with their farms again. The 25 oxen had grown to a herd of more than 100, their presence a constant, breathing reminder of what had been lost and what had been found. Elias Thorne passed away in his sleep at the age of 81. He was buried in the small family plot on the hill overlooking his farm. His grandson Leo, now 32 and a respected leader in the community, carved his headstone. It didn't list his date of birth or death. It just had his name, and below it, the image of a black cherry yoke. The world is addicted to force. It is in love with the hammer and sees every problem as a nail. It believes that with enough energy, enough money, enough raw power, any obstacle can be overcome, any system can be optimized, any inconvenient truth can be flattened into submission. It builds machines that amplify this belief, machines that know only how to push forward or how to break. But wisdom is not the application of force. It is the understanding of limits. It is knowing the difference between a rock that can be moved and a wall that must be respected. It is the ability to listen to what the land is telling you, instead of shouting at it what you want it to be. This is a quiet and patient kind of knowledge, one that is not found in spreadsheets or course samples, but is accumulated over generations, stored in the grain of a wooden yoke or the memory of an old man's hands. It does not promise speed or spectacular profit. It promises only this: that which is rigid will inevitably break. That which adapts endures.